All right, so now I'm going to show you how the laissez-faire theory of classical economics explains the closing of a recessionary gap automatically. So this is without the government intervening. This is without the government or any economic leaders doing something on purpose to close a recessionary gap. So what I have over here is a small labor market graph, because the labor market is involved in the automatic closing of a recessionary gap. Here you can see the aggregate market. Down here we have real GDP as the quantity of production in the entire economy. Up here we have the price level, which really isn't an issue we're going to discuss right now. But you can see the long run aggregate supply curve here, short run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and you can see that the intersection of short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand giving us actual output in the economy, real GDP, that is to the left of natural real GDP, indicating that this economy is in a recessionary gap, okay? And so what's happening in this economy is that output is lower than it should be. Output is lower than ideal, okay? Which means that we're going to have higher unemployment. Remember, by Okun's law? So I'm going to write some of this stuff down. In this case, we know that real GDP is less than natural real GDP, right? That is by definition, okay? That is the definition of a recessionary gap. Now, because output is low, that means that unemployment is high. So we're going to say that the unemployment rate is higher than the natural rate of unemployment. Higher than the natural rate of unemployment, which means that we are not at full employment here, right? And so, how do we know that is true? Well, that's by Okun's law. Remember, Okun's law says that when real GDP goes down, unemployment goes up, right? So this is according to Okun's law. Now, we have a higher unemployment rate. One of the things that we just learned about the labor market is that we're going to have a higher unemployment rate when quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded in the labor market. So we're going to go over here to the labor market, and we're going to look at a situation where quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, okay? Well, quantity supplied is only going to be greater than quantity demanded if the wage rate is too high. So we can infer, so I'm going to put W sub H, okay? We have a wage rate that is higher than the equilibrium wage rate, okay? And so what we're going to put here is the only way for quantity supplied to be greater than quantity demanded in the labor market, this implies a high unemployment, right? The only way that can be true is if the equilibrium price, okay, I'm going to put P wage here. I know there's lots of different ways of representing the price or the wage in the labor market, is greater than the equilibrium price in the labor market. In labor market. And therefore, what are market forces going to do? Market forces are going to push wage rates down. Now remember the assumption that we made when we first just started talking about classical economic theory, that wage rates are flexible up and down in the market. Therefore, market forces are going to pressure wage rates to go down, okay? And so we're going to put here market forces will push wages lower. And so wages are going to go down in the economy, in the labor market. And when that happens, okay, it's going to increase quantity demanded and it's going to decrease quantity supplied, so that quantity supplied and quantity demanded are going to equal each other in the labor market. So it's going to bring it to a place where it's going to bring us to full employment, right? All right, well, watch what's going to happen after that happens. So after that happens, so a decrease in wages, this is now step 4. Well, I want you to consider what wages are to businesses. Wages are a cost, right? Businesses pay out money to labor so that they can produce. Higher wages mean a higher production cost. Lower wages mean a lower production cost. And so a decrease in wages means that in the economy, production costs are going to decrease. Now, I want you to think back a few lessons when we talked about the aggregate market and how production costs affect the aggregate market. And what we learned was that production costs are what predict short-run aggregate supply. That when production costs go down, that results in an increase in short-run aggregate supply. So lower production costs in the economy means an increase in short-run aggregate supply. And you may or may not remember that when short-run aggregate supply increases, that results in a rightward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve. So I'm going to put over here R shift. Okay? So now we're going to come over here. I want to show you what's happening. As wage rates go down, production costs go down, and short-run aggregate supply goes up. So wage rates will come down a little, short-run aggregate supply will increase a little. And they'll keep coming down until they hit equilibrium, and short-run aggregate supply will keep shifting to the right until, watch this is awesome, until short-run aggregate supply, SRAS prime, intersects aggregate demand at natural real GDP. And what that means is that real GDP, while that's happening, is going to increase until it is equal to natural real GDP. So the last step here is that real GDP will increase until real GDP is equal to natural real GDP. And when real GDP is equal to natural real GDP, that means that we have closed the recessionary gap and put the economy back into long-run equilibrium. Closing the recessionary gap and returning the economy to long-run equilibrium. And so this procedure right here with these supporting graphs show how classical economic theory explains that a recessionary gap will close automatically. Nowhere in here is the government getting involved. Now, are there human interactions? Yes, wages have to come down. How do wages come down? Well, workers who want to have work, they're out of work. They're going to the employers and saying, hey, please hire me. I'm willing to take a job for less money. And as more of the workers go to the employers and say, hire me, I'll work for less money, what that does is that brings down the wages. And then as the wages come down, that naturally businesses now pay less money and are willing and able to produce more in the economy. And then they do produce more in the economy, and it brings real GDP up. back up to natural real GDP. And classical economic theory says that this is going to happen automatically, and so the government does not have to get involved. The government can keep its hands off. Laissez-faire. Okay? Now, here's the key thing that I want you to note. What just happened? That in classical economic theory, output gaps close by a shift in short-run aggregate supply. And not by a shift in aggregate demand, okay? And so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the exact same procedure, except we're going to talk about closing an inflationary gap automatically. All right, so now we're going to see how classical economic theory explains the closing of an inflationary gap automatically. So you can see here's our labor market over here. That's going to play a role. Ultimately, this output gap is going to close because of a shift in short-run aggregate supply, not aggregate demand. But you can see here the intersection between short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand is over here to the right, and that is higher than natural real GDP. And so real GDP in an inflationary gap is greater than natural real GDP. By definition, we are overproducing in the economy. And I know many people think that that's not possible, but it is. We are overusing our resources. We could potentially burn out our resources. And so this inflationary gap needs to close by decreasing output in the economy to an acceptable level, to the ideal level of output where we're not overusing our resources. Well, when real GDP is greater than natural real GDP, that means that unemployment is too low. Okay, so we have high output, that means low unemployment. So that means that unemployment, or the unemployment rate, is less than the natural rate of unemployment. Remember what that means. That means that we are eroding frictional and structural unemployment. We're using labor resources that we shouldn't be using. We need to leave space for them to transfer jobs or to acquire the skills necessary for a job. So this is according to Oken's law, right? And that means when unemployment is lower than the natural rate of unemployment, that means that quantity supplied is less than quantity demanded in the labor market. Now, the only way that quantity supplied can be less than quantity demanded in a market is if the wage rate or if the price is too low. Let me grab this marker over here. So what we have is a situation where we're going to put W sub L, and you can see here that the wage rate is too low. This is quantity demanded, this is quantity supplied, and we now have a shortage of labor in the labor market. There's not as many people offering to work as they are being demanded, okay? And so what's going to happen, remember what happens in a market when the price is too low. What's going to happen is market forces are going to push the wage rate up, right? Demanders are going to offer more money to the workers to encourage them to come into the labor force and work jobs. And the only way they can get them to come into the labor force and work jobs is by offering them more money. And the result is going to be an increase in wage rates. So now what's going to happen is wage rates rise due to a shortage in the labor market. Okay? And that shortage exists because the price, the wage in the labor market, is lower than the equilibrium price or the equilibrium wage in the labor market. Okay? All right, so now that wages are rising, an increase in wages, what does that do to production costs in the economy? Well, if businesses have to pay more money for their labor, that's going to lead to an increase in production costs. And remember that production costs are what affect short-run aggregate supply. It's what changes short-run aggregate supply. And when costs go up, supply goes down. So we're going to have a decrease in short-run aggregate supply in the economy, which is effectively going to be a left shift. A left shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve. So the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left. And when it shifts to the left, short-run aggregate supply prime, it's going to intersect the aggregate demand curve at the long-run aggregate supply curve. Real GDP is going to decrease until it is equal to natural real GDP, and it's going to close the inflationary gap. See? In classical economic theory, output gaps closed by a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve. The short-run aggregate supply curve is shifting left. Why? Because short-run aggregate supply is decreasing. Why is aggregate supply decreasing? Because production costs are increasing. Why are production costs increasing? Because wages are increasing. Why are wages increasing? Because quantity supplied is less than quantity demanded in the labor market. There's a shortage of labor, and businesses, quantity demanded, are offering more money to labor to come work for them to fill positions so that they can produce. Okay? And so the net result here is going to be a decrease in real GDP as the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left until real GDP is equal to natural real GDP, closing the inflationary gap and returning the economy to long-run equilibrium. Okay? And all of that is going to happen automatically, all because businesses are going to offer more money to potential workers, okay? Potential labor. And so this is what classical economic theory says will happen. This is why classical economic theory says that the government doesn't have to get involved. So the prescription of classical economic theory when dealing with an output gap do nothing. Everything will resolve itself all by itself. Classical economic theory.